everyone, Aric here, and this is another episode of Aric Abridged. And the topic of today's episode is going to be Aric McBay's culture of resistance. So this is sort of a follow-up to my previous video, which was about Aric McBay's concept of a culture of defeat. So just to summarize what I was talking about in that video, Aric McBay wrote a book called Full Spectrum Resistance, which is essentially a guidebook to strategy and tactics for the left in the modern era, taking into account some of our failures and successes and trying to understand why that our different tactics and different strategies led to failures and successes. So the previous video was discussing what he calls a culture of defeat, and that is what he thinks has come to pervade the left in the modern era. And instead, what he wants to do is promote what he calls a culture of resistance. So Aric McBay, just like in the culture of defeat, he sort of boils down all of these basic principles that he thinks are constitutive of a culture of resistance into bullet points. In the culture of defeat, I think there were 5 or 6 different bullet points, but here he's got like 10 or 11 different bullet points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yep, I just went back and checked. 11. So suffice to say, Aric McBay has quite a bit more to say about what he thinks leads to successful cultures on the left, as opposed to what leads to those which are failing us. First of all, he says cultures of resistance have memory. That is to say, they remember their history of struggle. And that's not to say only the history of struggle that they've lived through, although obviously that is going to be operative, but also those who came before them. All of the different attempts at overthrowing this system of domination and oppression that have taken place throughout history, both in their local history, but also in the movement that they consider themselves connected to. This is important because those oppressive structures do a lot of work to suppress these memories of struggle, the history of what has come before, and the defeats and the successes that have led to the weakening of those structures. The result is that you get a people who believe that there is no possibility of resistance because they've forgotten every successful attempt that has come beforehand. So cultures of resistance are those that are not disconnected from this memory of struggle, those that retell their history of struggle time and time again to each other and to each new generation as it comes to struggle alongside those who have come before. And this is important because those who have a memory of previous struggles have the understanding that they could struggle again. The next thing he has on his bullet points is that cultures of resistance have a living culture. This leads really nicely out of the previous statement about cultures of resistance that they make sure to remember their past. They canonize those events. They tell stories about them. They create art about them. They make sure that their culture is constantly being reinvigorated by these stories of the past that remind them of what could happen now and what might happen in the future. In cultures of resistance, they never forget their struggle to the degree that it becomes a daily part of life. It's integrated into the culture that they share among each other. They know the names, they know the exact events, they have created art around it that they mutually appreciate. Cultures of resistance often have these sorts of tales that they tell each other and the children as they grow older. The next bullet point is what Aric McBay calls an oppositional culture. An oppositional culture is not just an alternative to the existing culture. It is not an opportunity to drop out from the ongoings of society. It is a culture that is defined by its opposition to structures of domination and oppression throughout the world. And this part about it not being a culture of retreat is really important. It is a culture that continues to interact with these structures of domination, trying to undermine them time and time again, instead of trying to run away from them. An oppositional culture is precisely not a culture of retreat. But McBay offers a caveat nonetheless, and I'll just read that in full. He says, that doesn't mean that resistors don't need retreats, havens, or areas of redoubt. We do. Those places may be community centers, farms, or longhouses. But in an oppositional culture, those sanctuaries and autonomous zones are not places to hopelessly await an inevitable defeat. They are bases for resistors to rest and recuperate, to strategize and to organize, and they are bases from which to launch offensives. So this brings us to his next point, which is focus on action and material gains. A culture of resistance cannot be one that just focuses on artistic renderings and telling of old stories and heroic poetry about their revolutionary heroes. A culture of resistance has to be focused around resistance. That is to say, it is a culture that is oriented around action and extraction of material gains from the enemy. A culture of resistance recognizes that we learn from action, that action is iterative, that we're supposed to be looking at what we have done, learning what was good about it, and where it failed. In a culture of resistance, action, including failed actions, should not discourage us. They should be seen as experiments that we can learn from in order to understand how to approach those same problems the next time we come across them. This is important because it grounds the culture in reality. It grounds it in the extraction of material gains. And I'd just like to note that I think this part is extremely important because people need to feel the satisfaction of success. It is really important that we are constantly thinking about how we can create these discrete goals that as people carry out those discrete goals, they get the satisfaction of achievement, that it's not just casting far off into the future what our success parameter looks like, but instead recognizing that our greater success relies upon a bunch of iterative successes that we experience in our day-to-day life. But that requires that we're actually successful, which requires that we earnestly understand what went right and wrong in our previous action. So now on to the next bullet point, solidarity. So I think on a lot of occasions on the left, this word solidarity is kind of a buzzword. People think it's good. They like the way it sounds. They say they express solidarity with lots of people, but they don't really practice it, in fact. However, Aric McBay says that solidarity is the bedrock of a culture of resistance. Organizers need to understand that they have a common struggle with all of those who resist domination. That is not to say that they never condemn the actions of anyone else, and it is not to say that they openly support everything that everyone else has done, but they should be able to recognize the shared struggle they have with other people who have their common enemy. This is not to say that we don't learn from our mistakes. It's not to say that we can't levy criticisms against one another. We need to be wise about how we levy criticism and take seriously the importance of maintaining the bonds of solidarity between ourselves and other people who share our common enemy. And Aric McBay says that if we cannot form solidarity with people that have a shared enemy because of some strategic or tactical imperatives that we might have, then we should at least avoid wasting our time and energy on infighting. And I think we can all recognize that we all have a part in this, myself included. And I think that we should try to reduce the amount of time that we spend arguing with fellow leftists, especially those who we do have a common strategic and tactical imperative with. So this brings us to Aric McBay's next point about a culture of resistance, and that is the willingness to risk and self-sacrifice. So this is one I've talked about on the channel kind of a lot, and it's one that at different times have been kind of controversial with people I've spoken with, but I contend that it is one of the most important principles of a culture of resistance. Cultures of resistance recognize that self-sacrifice is not only inevitable, but necessary to get things done. I want to clarify that self-sacrifice doesn't have to be absolute. In fact, sometimes that's harmful. It's harmful to everyone around you. It's harmful to your ability to do things for a longer sustained time. But we have to get out of this liberal mindset that when we are doing action, the main imperative is to maintain our own comfort. It is to maintain our own well-being. That what we are always trying to do is look for our own sheer self-interest. That is not the case. In fact, it is going to require us to sacrifice a lot of ourselves and put ourselves under a pretty extreme risk under certain circumstances in order to get things done, in order to actually offer a successful resistance against structures of domination. He does emphasize that these acts of self-sacrifice don't necessarily have to be super risky. Maybe you're helping your friend repair their car on the side of the street or something. There is some aspect of self-sacrifice to all of these acts which help other people. They're going to often put you out of your comfort zone. They're often going to get in the way of your other plans. It can be that kind of minor scale. It doesn't have to be these really risky things. But we should have some recognition at the same time that these acts of self-sacrifice will often escalate to more risky behaviors, especially as we become more and more of a threat to the prevailing structure of domination. And Aric McBay emphasizes, as I did a moment ago, that this is not about martyrdom. This is not about seeking out risk for its own sake. This is not about the sort of self-destructive self-sacrifice. That is not only unnecessary, but often counterproductive. Instead, what he's trying to emphasize is that self-sacrifice and risk are part and parcel of the struggle. The next point he gets to is material and moral support for those on the front lines. He emphasizes that those who are often most capable of risk are those who are able-bodied, those who are young. And we can't really all be doing that all the time. But those people who cannot engage on the front lines, who cannot do that kind of risky activity, should always be offering material and moral support to those people. It's often been said that for every frontliner, there are 100 supports, and that remains the case in any sort of wide-scale militant activity. Aric says that a culture of resistance is continuously engaged in these acts of support, both moral and material, to those who struggle. The next bullet point he has is communities and community building. That is to say, building communities, building these connections of people is imperative for the success of the proliferation and the continuation of a culture of resistance. Hierarchical structures seek to break us apart as to make us easier to exploit. And so what we need to be doing is connecting people back together, combating isolation and loneliness, and trying to create robust networks of connections among other people who also want to resist oppression. These connections with other radicals are often what grow into the more material actions, such as building organizations, creating affinity groups, creating alliances of organizations, and so on. These often root from engagement in a culture of resistance, specifically communities that are built around resistance. And so, Aric notes, this means we need to be building these communities actively and earnestly and consciously, knowing that we are purposely creating these communities in order to combat isolation and loneliness, but also recognizing that these communities are imperative for us to have any success as a movement. So Aric McBay notes with his next bullet point that it cannot only be that we are community building, we also have to be consciously movement building. That is to say, these communities cannot just be a network of people, they also need to be constantly encouraging people to act. I'll just quote Aric McBay directly here. He says, "Cultures of resistance must think critically and strategically about how to build effective and vibrant movements. And there is a reciprocal relationship between resistance movements and cultures of resistance. Each builds and strengthens the other." So here, Aric McBay is noting that just having the culture, just having the community is not sufficient for you to have a culture of resistance. Your culture, your community needs to be focused around the creation of action, encouraging more people to action, enabling them to act. And I think we're missing that a lot on the left. I see that there is a lot of communities, but these communities are not always indicative of a culture of resistance. They're not encouraging people to do anything in the real world, and they're not enabling them with the knowledge that would allow them to do things in the real world. So I absolutely agree with Aric McBay here that it is not enough to just create a community. In order for it to be part of a culture of resistance, it needs to be a community that enables people to action. So if this movement can be successful, then this brings us to Aric McBay's next bullet point, and that is parallel institutions. So I'll just start by saying that here, Aric McBay is talking about dual power or prefiguration of social structures. What he says is that successful movements begin to build institutions. That's just a natural part of a successful movement. It's sort of part and parcel to its success. It is not only the result of its success, it leads to its success. So it has this sort of reciprocal relationship with the success of the movement itself. In Aric McBay's mind, this is just because as the movement becomes more sophisticated and it begins to contain more and more connections, it will then begin to form more sophisticated, long-standing structures in the process. And he notes that this is actually highly connected to a movement's ability to become a revolutionary movement. That without these institutions, you really can never carry out a revolution. But he notes that all these revolutionary movements that succeeded in gaining the things that they asked for with either a complete overthrow of the previous society or in just getting a series of concessions from the state, they almost all started by building these services themselves beforehand. That is to say, they figured out where people's needs were. Let's say they needed healthcare or maternal leave or whatever it was, and then they figured out a way to provide that to people previous to the concession of the workplace or the state or whatever other institution they were dealing with. So Aric McBay says, any place where those institutions already exist, those bottom-up dual power institutions, those have to be focused on and strengthened to the utmost wherever they are found. So we need to build them actively, but we also need to support them where they have already been created. And often they have existed in the past, but have since fallen apart. In that occasion, Aric McBay says that we should also try to rekindle those past institutions. Really, one will notice that this is an incredibly important aspect. He's basically saying that if it doesn't exist, create it. If it has existed in the past, recreate it. And if it does exist, strengthen it. And this leads us to the last bullet point on the list, which is subsistence and community sufficiency. And this is highly related to the last one about institutions. Essentially, what he says is that successful movements should have the ability to provide for their own people. This means we've got to focus on the basic needs that people have. We need to be able to provide food. We need to be able to provide housing. We need to be able to provide people health care. This also includes things like self-defense. It includes helping people learn how to organize in disasters, for example. All of these skills are going to be necessary for the community sufficiency of the organizational left as we proceed into the future. It's not to say that each of us should be able to provide all of those, or even every organization should be able to provide all of those. It is to say that we need to be able to create networks of organizations, networks of people with different skills in order to fulfill these needs of the people around us. And that requires us to look at people's needs and ask ourselves how those needs can be truly met, not in an abstract sense, but in a factual sense. And Aric McBay notes that this is why occupation campaigns, which is to say hierarchical structures occupying territories, they always try to separate the people that are there from their natural means of self-sufficiency. Take, for example, the process of colonization. Think about how they're trying to separate the indigenous people of that land from their capability to sustain themselves and their community. The idea is if you can get a people to no longer have the means of subsistence, then you are going to create a captive populace that relies upon you to provide those things instead. So I think you can see as we get to the end of these bullet points that Aric McBay is saying that a culture of resistance also requires a material base by which that culture can provide for the people within that culture. That is to say, Aric McBay is noting the importance of dual power. Even in the section he's talking about a culture of resistance, he's still talking about the necessity of these broader institutional social structures. And that is extremely in line with the sort of things that I say on this channel. So here I am in much agreement with Aric McBay again. So I highly recommend that if you haven't read this book, that you go read Full Spectrum Resistance. I'm not all the way through it yet. I know there will be some parts of it I disagree with, but I still think it is highly, highly helpful for people in the modern era trying to understand what it looks like to organize in the conditions that we have been given. I think that's about it for this video, though. If you liked the video, you should click like. If you've been given numerous of my videos in your feed, you should probably subscribe to the channel, as this is exactly the kind of stuff that I do here on Anarch. And lastly, if you want to support the channel, if you want to see this channel sustain itself into the future, then I would invite you to go become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/anarch, and you can become a donor for any amount, $2, $5, $7, $10, $12, or $20. There are different patron tiers for any of your needs, or you can go edit it to, like $10,000 a month if you want, I think that's what you should do personally. But if you wanted to maybe not do such a large amount, there's a bunch of smaller amounts available to you as well, You would also get access to the Anarch Discord. Remember, you just want to go into your settings after you go and subscribe on Patreon, and you just want to enter your Discord information, and that integration should automatically invite you to the Anarch Discord, which is a wonderful community where you have all kinds of great people there. We talk about history and praxis and theory and all kinds of things that have nothing to do with politics. If that sounds interesting to you, you should go become a patron. Anyway, that is the spiel. I appreciate y'all listening, especially if you're here till the very end. You must be truly a diehard, or you've got this on in the background and you're like, damn, when is he going to be done with the spiel? If that's the case, I'm happy you're here as well. In any occasion, that is everything. I'm done. I'll see y'all next time.